The dust of Redemption Gulch tasted like forgotten promises and baked regret. It swirled around the auction block, a makeshift stage of raw timber erected in the center of town, a cruel theater for a cruel play. On the block stood 3 women, their hands bound loosely in front of them, their dresses patched but clean. They were the afternoon's main event, listed in the town ledger not by name, but as Lot 7, mining debt collateral. Ilara, the eldest, stood straight, her chin held high, a fortress of defiance with fear deep in her eyes like prisoners behind stone walls. Beside her, Brenna trembled, her gaze fixed on her own worn boots, trying to will herself invisible. And Maeve, barely a woman at all, wept silently, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. The crowd was a restless beast, a mix of leering opportunists, callous drunks, and a few townsfolk who wore shame like a heavy coat in the blistering sun. The auctioneer, a man with a face like sour milk, grinned. "What am I bid for this fine lot?" he crowed, his voice slick with practiced avarice. 3 healthy widows, strong backs for laundry, good hands for mending. Their husbands, God rest their souls, left a sizable debt with our esteemed Judge Thorne. A debt that must be paid. He gestured to a man seated in a high-backed chair in the shade of the general store's porch. Judge Thorne. The man who owned the town, the mine, the law, and now, it seemed, the very souls of these women. A low, mocking bid of $10 came from the crowd, followed by a burst of cruel laughter. In the back, leaning against a watering trough, a man stood apart from the rest. His name was Silas, and his face was a map of old sorrows. He was a rancher from the high mesas, a man who came to town only when necessity demanded it, his silence as vast and profound as the land he worked. He had not come for this. He had come for salt licks and barbed wire. But he had heard the commotion, and now he watched, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He saw not 3 strangers, but the ghost of his own wife, of his own little girl, taken from him by fever years ago. He saw their vulnerability, their terror, and in the jeering faces of the crowd, he saw the world's casual cruelty, a cruelty he knew all too well. Judge Tiberius Thorne shifted in his chair, savoring the spectacle. He was a man carved from greed, his large frame wrapped in a fine wool suit that defied the oppressive heat, a declaration of his untouchable status. His smile was cold as winter wind on a gravestone, a smile that always preceded bad things for someone else. He nodded at the auctioneer, a silent command to continue the charade. $10, the auctioneer mocked. Is that all we have for the diligent settlement of a righteous debt? These women's husbands worked Judge Thorne's silver mine. They took his tools, his food, his generosity. This debt is a matter of honor. The lie was so audacious it hung in the air, thick and foul. Everyone knew the men had died in a shaft collapse, a collapse caused by Thorne's own negligence, his refusal to pay for proper timber supports. But in Redemption Gulch, Thorne's word was the only truth that mattered. Another bid came, $15, from a grimy prospector with yellowed teeth who looked at the women like they were cattle. Ilara flinched as his gaze fell on her, her composure cracking for just a moment. Silas saw it. He saw the tremor that ran through Brenna and the fresh wave of tears that streamed down Maeve's face. Something inside him, a thing he thought had died with his family, began to stir. It was a slow, hot burn, a rage building like a furnace deep in his soul. He had built walls around his heart to keep the world out, to keep the pain of his memories contained. He had sworn off other people's troubles. His own were enough. But the sight of this calculated, public degradation, this preying on the helpless in the name of a false justice, was a hammer blow to those walls. He pushed himself off the watering trough, his movement slow, deliberate. The dust swirled around his boots as he took a step forward. He was not a large man, nor an imposing one. He was just a quiet rancher in a worn coat, his features etched with sun and sorrow. But as he began to move, a change came over the crowd. The jeers faltered. The laughter died in their throats. There was something in his eyes, a stillness, a depth that commanded attention. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and had just found something worth fighting for. The story of the three widows was a tragedy whispered in hushed tones long before they were dragged to the auction block. Ilara, Brenna, and Maeve had been wives to miners, good men who chased silver in the dark guts of Thorns Mountain. Ilara's husband, Liam, had been the crew's leader, a man with calloused hands and a quiet sense of fairness. Brenna's husband, Finn, was the youngest, full of laughter and dreams of buying a small farm. And Maeve's husband, Ronan, was the strong, steady heart of the group, a man who spoke little but loved his wife fiercely. They worked the most dangerous shaft in the Morning Stars mine, a place other miners called the Widowmaker. Judge Thorn pushed them relentlessly, demanding more ore, faster production, while ignoring Liam's repeated warnings about the groaning support beams and the shifting rock. Then came the day the mountain shrugged. A deep, sickening rumble, a cloud of dust choking the mine entrance, and a silence more terrible than any scream. Thorn had declared it a tragic accident. He delivered a flowery eulogy in the town square, his face a mask of counterfeit sorrow. A week later, the mask came off. He produced a ledger, its pages filled with his own spidery script, detailing a massive, fictitious debt. He claimed their husbands had taken advances for equipment they never bought, for supplies they never used. It was a monstrous lie, a second burial for the men he'd already sent to their graves. He was using their deaths as an excuse to seize their meager homes, their few possessions, and ultimately, their wives, repackaging their enslavement as a lawful settlement. This was the true nature of Judge Thorn's power, not just cruelty, but the insidious craft of twisting the law into a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. The auction was not about money, Thorn had plenty of that. It was about power. It was a demonstration, a public lesson to anyone else in Redemption Gulch who might one day consider defying him. He wanted to own the women's despair, to put it on display. He was breaking them not for profit, but for the principle of it, to reinforce the foundation of fear upon which his empire was built. Silas walked through the parted crowd, each step heavy with purpose. The world seemed to narrow, the noise fading until all he could hear was the frantic beating of his own heart and the auctioneer's droning voice. He saw the moment Ilara's eyes found his. He saw the flicker of confusion, then a spark of something that might have been a desperate, dying ember of hope. He stopped 10 feet from the stage, the sun hot on the back of his neck. The auctioneer, irritated by the interruption, scowled. "Do you have a bid, rancher, or are you just blocking the view?" A few nervous titters rose from the crowd, but they died quickly under the weight of Silas's gaze. He ignored the auctioneer. His eyes were locked on Judge Thorn. For a long moment, the two men took each other's measure across the dusty square. Thorn, cushioned by power and arrogance, saw a nobody, a dirt scrabbler from the hills. Silas saw a vulture, a man grown fat on the suffering of others. The memory that had tormented him for years rose unbidden, the image of his wife, her face pale with fever, her hand in his, and his own helpless anguish. He had fought the fever with every herb and prayer he knew, but the world had been indifferent to his struggle. Now, here was a different kind of sickness, a man-made plague of greed and cruelty, and it was not invincible. It could be fought. It could be faced. He cleared his throat, his voice rusty from disuse. The words came out quiet, almost a whisper, yet they carried across the square with the force of a thunderclap. "I'll take them," the auctioneer blinked, cupping a hand to his ear. "What was that? Speak up." Silas drew a breath, and this time, his voice was clear and steady, ringing with a conviction that startled even himself. He pointed a steady finger toward the stage. "I said, I will take them all." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was not part of the script. This was not a leering bid for a servant. This was something else entirely. It was a challenge. It was defiance. He hadn't declared war, not with threats or boasts. He had done it with 4 simple words. The air in the town square grew thick and still, stretched tight like a held breath. Judge Thorn slowly rose from his chair, his expression of smug amusement curdling into a mask of cold fury. The quiet rancher had not just placed a bid, he had thrown down a gauntlet. "You will take them." Thorn's voice was dangerously soft, a predator's purr. "And what, pray tell, is your bid, rancher? Do you have the $200 to clear their debt? Or do you plan to pay in dust and good intentions?" He meant to humiliate Silas, to expose him as a penniless fool. The crowd murmured, sensing the shift. This was no longer an auction, it was a duel of wills. Silas met the judge's glare without flinching. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't open it. He just held it. "I have the coin," he said simply. He was bluffing. He had $40 to his name, enough for his supplies and nothing more. But in his gaze, there was no lie, only an unshakable certainty that felt more real than gold. He was betting everything he didn't have on the strength of his own conviction. Thorne's eyes narrowed into slits. He studied Silas, searching for the crack in his resolve, the flicker of fear that would betray the bluff. He found none. The judge was a man who understood bullies and sycophants, but the quiet, immovable courage of a man like Silas was a foreign language to him. What is happening in your mind right now? As you stand here, watching this silent battle unfold, what are you feeling? Do you see the folly of a poor man challenging a tyrant, or do you feel that spark of hope, that belief that one person, standing firm, can make a giant tremble? What would you do in Silas's place? When faced with pure evil, would you flinch, or would you stand firm? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe one man's courage can change the world, make sure you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss what happens next. The standoff held for another 10 seconds, an eternity in the scorching heat. Finally, with a snarl of contempt, Thorne made his decision. To call the bluff would be to risk his own authority if, by some miracle, the rancher actually had the money. Better to let the fool have his prize and deal with him later, away from prying eyes. Sold. Thorne barked, his voice dripping with venom. To the sentimental rancher. For $200. Collect your property. The word property landed like a whip crack. Elara, Brenner, and Maeve flinched, but Silas stepped forward, his focus absolute. He walked onto the stage, ignoring the sneering auctioneer and the furious glare of Judge Thorne. He pulled a small knife from his belt and, with 3 quick, precise movements, cut the ropes binding the women's hands. He didn't speak to them, not yet. He simply offered a hand to Elara, then to Brenner, and finally to Maeve, helping them down from the block as if they were honored guests, not purchased chattel. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Judge Thorne strode over, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Your receipt," he hissed, thrusting the pages at Silas. It was the deed of debt, a legal document transferring ownership of the women's servitude to him. "See that you get your money's worth." Silas took the papers without looking at them and tucked them into his coat. He turned to the women, his voice gentle for the first time. "My wagon is over there. We should go." The journey back to Silas's ranch on the high mesa was wrapped in a thick, suffocating silence. The women sat huddled together in the wagon bed, their fear now mixed with a profound confusion. They had been saved from one monster only to be delivered into the hands of a stranger. Who was this man? What did he want from them? Elara watched him, studying the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands held the reins, steady and capable. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving town. The silence wasn't cruel, like Thorne's, but it was vast and unreadable, and that was its own kind of terror. As the wagon climbed higher, leaving the dusty scar of Redemption Gulch behind, the air grew cooler, cleaner. The landscape opened up into rolling hills of sage and grass, the sky a brilliant, endless blue. Still, Silas said nothing. He was wrestling with the enormity of what he had done. He had spent years building a fortress of solitude, and in a single afternoon, he had brought 3 lives into the heart of it. He had no plan, no idea what came next. All he knew was that he couldn't have left them there. They arrived at Silas's ranch as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet. It was a simple, lonely place, a small, sturdy cabin, a solid barn, and corrals that held a few dozen head of hardy cattle. It was clean, orderly, and profoundly quiet. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop not in front of his own cabin, but beside a smaller, secondary cottage set a short distance away. It was his old bunkhouse, long unused but well maintained. "This will be yours," he said, his voice breaking the long silence. He got down from the wagon and looked at the three women, truly meeting their eyes for the first time. He saw their exhaustion, their fear, their cautious curiosity. There's food in the pantry. Water in the basin. The door has a lock on the inside. No one will bother you. Ilara, finding her voice, asked the question that hung between them all. Why? Her tone was not accusatory, just deeply, honestly perplexed. Why did you do this? Silas looked away, toward the horizon, toward the graves of his wife and daughter marked by two simple wooden crosses on a nearby hill. No one should be for sale, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't hide. Get some rest. He turned and walked to his own cabin, leaving them to the privacy he had promised. For 3 days, a tentative peace settled over the ranch. Silas left food and fresh milk on their porch each morning before sunrise and did not approach again. He worked his land, his familiar routines a comfort against the turmoil in his heart. Inside the cottage, the women began to breathe again. They cleaned, they cooked, they talked. They began to heal. On the 4th evening, as Silas sat on his porch watching the stars emerge, Ilara approached him. She carried a small, cloth-wrapped object. We have to tell you something, she said, her voice firm. Brenna and Maeve stood behind her, their faces pale but resolute. Silas motioned for her to sit. Ilara unwrapped the object. It was a heavy, oddly shaped rock, but streaked through it were thick, unmistakable veins of pure, gleaming gold. This is why our husbands were killed, she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of the secret. It wasn't a cave-in. It was murder. The gold in Ilara's hands caught the faint light from Silas's cabin, gleaming with a sinister beauty. It felt cold and heavy, a nugget of pure greed. Liam found it, Ilara explained, her voice low and urgent. A hidden chamber, off the main shaft. It wasn't silver. It was gold. More than any of them had ever seen, she recounted how their husbands, knowing Thorn would steal the claim and likely silence them, had decided to work in secret. They planned to gather enough proof of Thorn's unsafe practices and enough gold to hire a real lawyer from the capital, to expose him and secure the claim for themselves. They were just days away from leaving. Thorn must have found out, Brenna added, her voice barely a whisper. He was always watching, his foreman always snooping. Ilara looked at Silas, her eyes pleading for him to understand. The cave-in was too perfect. It only collapsed that one section, where they were working. Liam told me the night before that one of Thorn's men had been down there, acting strangely, near the main support pillar. The story settled into place, its ugly pieces clicking together into a picture of calculated evil. Thorn hadn't just let the men die through negligence, he had arranged their deaths. He had murdered them to steal their discovery, and then, in an act of supreme arrogance, he had created the false debt to claim their widows as a final, triumphant insult. Silas looked from the gold nugget to the faces of the three women. He was no longer just a man who had performed a single act of charity. He was now the keeper of a deadly secret, a witness to a crime that the most powerful man in the county had committed. The simple act of buying their freedom had entangled him in a conspiracy of murder and theft. His quiet life was over. The solitude he had cultivated for years had been shattered, not just by the presence of these women, but by the burden of their truth. He could tell them to leave, to take their secret and their danger far away from his land. Or he could help them see it through. The choice was his. He looked back toward the two small graves on the hill. He had been unable to save his family from the random cruelty of fate. But this was not fate. This was a man. And a man could be stopped. He won't get away with it, Silas said, his voice a low growl. It was not a promise to them. It was a vow to himself. The next morning, Silas rode back down to Redemption Gulch. But this time, he rode not as a reclusive rancher, but as a man with a purpose forged in fire. He bypassed the main street and tethered his horse behind the small office of Doc Evans. The doctor was a weary, melancholic man who drank too much to forget the things he'd seen. He was one of the few who had looked ashamed at the auction. Silas entered without knocking. Doc Evans looked up from his desk, startled. "Silas? What are you doing here?" Silas placed the gold nugget on the doctor's desk. The doctor's eyes widened. "Good Lord, where did you get this?" "From the widows of the men you pronounced dead from a cave-in," Silas said, his voice flat and hard. The doctor slumped back in his chair, the color draining from his face. "I know what you're thinking," Doc Evans whispered, "and you're right. It wasn't right." He confessed that Thorne had him sign the death certificates before he'd even been allowed to properly examine the bodies. But he had seen enough. The injuries. They weren't just from crushing rock, Silas. One of them, Liam, he had a head wound that looked more like it came from a hammer than a falling stone. He had noted it down in his private ledger, a fact he kept hidden out of pure, unadulterated fear. Silas's next stop was the blacksmith's forge. Ben Miller was a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, another silent face from the auction. Silas told him the same story. The blacksmith's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists. "I knew it," he boomed, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Thorne bought a load of cheap, rotted timber from me a month before that collapse. I told him it wouldn't hold a chicken coop, let alone a mine shaft. He said it was for a new fence line. The liar, he, too, had been too frightened to speak out. A doctor's testimony and a blacksmith's knowledge. It wasn't much against a man like Thorne, but it was a start. It was truth. He's holding a town meeting tomorrow," Miller said, announcing his benevolent plan to expand the mine. Now that the claims are clear, it was the final piece. Thorne was about to publicly claim his prize. Inspired by Silas's unflinching resolve, by the simple courage of a man who had dared to stand up when they had not, the two men made a choice. The fear that had held them in its grip for so long was finally outweighed by their shame. "We'll stand with you," Doc Evans said, his voice surprisingly firm. "We'll tell them what we know." The alliance was forged, not in a grand chamber, but in the dusty, quiet corners of a town sick of its own cowardice. The town square was crowded again, but the mood was different. Judge Thorne stood on the steps of the general store, a self-satisfied smirk on his face, ready to announce his victory. He began to speak of progress, of prosperity, of the bright future he was building for Redemption Gulch upon the foundation of the unfortunate accident at the Morning Star mine. He was in the middle of a sentence when a clear voice cut through the air. "You're a liar and a murderer." Every head turned. Elara stood at the edge of the square, with Brenna and Maeve at her sides. They were no longer trembling victims. Their faces were set with a righteous fury. Silas stood just behind them, a silent sentinel, with Doc Evans and Ben Miller flanking him. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Thorne's face went rigid with shock and rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered. "These women are indebted servants. They have no right to speak." "We have every right," Elara called out, stepping forward. She held up the nugget of gold for all to see. "My husband didn't die in a cave-in. He was murdered by that man for this. He and his partners found gold, and Judge Thorne killed them to steal it." The crowd gasped. Doc Evans stepped forward. "She's telling the truth. The injuries on those men were not consistent with a simple collapse. I have the records." Ben Miller moved next to him, his voice booming across the square. "And the support timbers in that shaft were rotten. I told the judge myself they were unsafe. He used them anyway." The foundation of fear that Thorne had so carefully constructed began to crumble. The whispers in the crowd grew louder, angrier. People who had lost loved ones in Thorne's mines before, people who had been cheated and intimidated by him for years, felt a surge of collective courage. The tide was turning. Thorne, seeing his power evaporate before his eyes, became desperate. His face contorted in a snarl of pure hatred. His hand darted inside his coat, pulling out a silver-plated revolver. "Silence!" he shrieked, pointing the gun at Elara. The crowd fell back in terror. But Silas was already moving. He was not a gunslinger, but he was a man who knew the grim calculus of survival. In one fluid motion, he drew the old pistol from his belt. There was no hesitation. A single shot rang out, deafening in the sudden silence. Thorn cried out in pain and surprise, his revolver clattering to the dusty ground, his hand shattered. Before anyone could react, the town sheriff, a man who had long been Thorn's puppet, looked at the wounded judge, then at the sea of hardened faces in the crowd, and made a swift political calculation. He walked over, picked up Thorn's gun, and placed the manacles on his uninjured wrist. Justice, swift and brutal and long overdue, had finally come to Redemption Gulch. Months later, the autumn sun cast a gentle, golden light over the high mesa. The ranch was no longer a monument to solitude. It was alive. The small bunkhouse had been expanded, made into a comfortable home. A new barn stood beside the old one, and the laughter of children, orphans from town whom the widows had taken in, danced on the crisp air. The gold from the Morning Star mine, legally awarded to Ilara, Brenner, and Maeve, had not been squandered. They had used it to create a small cooperative, offering fair wages and safe conditions to miners willing to work the claim honestly. They built a new life, not on vengeance, but on community and hope. Silas was a changed man. The deep lines of sorrow on his face were still there, but they were softened now by frequent smiles. He was no longer a recluse, but the quiet patriarch of a sprawling, unconventional family. He had found purpose not in forgetting his past, but in building a future worthy of its memory. He had learned that a heart, no matter how broken, could be taught to heal by letting others in. The moral of this story is a simple one, etched into the soul of the West. It is the truth that true wealth is not the gold we dig from the earth, but the courage we find in our hearts. It is the understanding that true power is not the fear a man can command, but the community he can inspire. The world is full of Judge Thorns, men who build empires on the backs of the vulnerable. But it is also full of men and women like Silas, Ilara, the doctor, and the blacksmith. It is changed not by the loud and the powerful, but by the quiet courage of those who refuse to look away when they see injustice. One person, choosing to stand, can awaken the conscience of a town and remind everyone that justice is not a gift, it is a battle we must choose to fight, every single day. The story of Silas and the three widows is a reminder of that eternal truth. If this story moved you and you believe in the power of a single act of courage, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of redemption and justice. And be sure to click on the video you see on your screen now. It's an even more powerful tale of a forgotten hero that you won't want to miss.